They say every dragon is born to rule the skies, breathe fire, crush armies, make gods kneel. Yeah, that wasn't me. I was born the runt of a clutch of 12 eggs. The smallest, the last to crack open, the one nobody wanted to see. When I finally crawled out covered in slime, blinking at the light, every single dragon in that cave turned away from me. My mother looked at me for exactly 3 seconds. Then she turned her back and started feeding the others. That was my welcome. My name is Kale. 6 months ago, I was a regular 28-year-old software engineer eating ramen at 2 a.m. in a Seoul apartment. I was watching a nature documentary about Komodo dragons when everything went black. Then I woke up as a dragon. Not a cool one. I'm what this world calls a merc scale. The absolute lowest dragon bloodline in existence. Last place out of 7 tiers. No fire breath. No lightning. No ice. My only breath ability smells like wet moss and crushed dreams. I personally verified this. In this world, every dragon is ranked by a bloodline tier. Tier 1 at the top, ancient sovereigns. The earth shakes when they yawn. Tier 2 are the war dragons, the kind that collapse entire mountains for fun. Tier 3 could eat a village and still feel hungry. Tiers 4 through 6, dangerous, feared, at least somewhat respected by the things that share a forest with them. Then there's me. Tier 7, dead last. The literal bottom of a food chain where I was supposed to be the predator. It's a special kind of humiliation. The other hatchlings figured out my rank by day 3. The biggest one, Crimson Bloodline, already the size of a large dog, walked over. He looked me dead in the eyes and bit off part of my tail. Not to eat it, not out of hunger, just to see if he could do it. He could. And that right there, that single moment, told me everything I needed to know about how this new life was going to go. Here's the thing about carrying a human soul inside a dragon body. You feel everything twice at the exact same time. Once as the animal, raw pain, pure instinct, the urge to snap back with everything you have and deal with the consequences later. And once as the human in the back of your own skull watching all of this happen and thinking, okay, so this is my life now. I didn't fight back today, not because I was scared of him, because I was already doing the math and the math was brutal. Tier 7 versus Tier 2. My mossy breath that smelled like a forest puddle versus his claws that were already longer than my whole head. I did what any rational person would do in that situation. I limped to the far corner of the cave, and I started thinking. My mother's name was Vorith, a tier for stoneback dragon. Massive, gray, armored in natural rock from head to tail. Respected, not the most powerful dragon in the Ashvin forest, but feared by most things that moved on 4 legs or fewer. She had survived a lot. She had 12 eggs this season because merc scale bloodline is recessive. 1 in every 100 stonebacks produces a runt like me. It's considered a shame among dragonkind. The kind of quiet disgrace that other adults whisper about when they think nobody is listening. That was their first mistake. Their biggest mistake, actually. I was always listening, every single night without exception. While the other hatchlings slept piled on each other for warmth, I stayed awake with my eyes half closed and my body completely still. I listened to the adult dragons talking beyond the cave entrance, mapped their patterns, studied their habits, filed everything away. Dragon language isn't roars and growls the way humans always imagine it. It's layered, chest vibrations, tongue clicks, breath rhythms. It's as complex as any human language. I picked it up in about 3 weeks flat. That's the one genuine perk of having a human brain. What I heard during those nights was not comforting. The forest we lived in, the Ashvin, was deeply contested territory. 3 major dragon clans held overlapping ranges here, and none of them were willing to simply agree on a clean set of borders. Emberclaw bloodline to the north, tier 2 war dragons, aggressive, expanding, looking for any excuse to push further south each season. Voidfang bloodline to the east, tier 1 ancient. The adults only mention them in low voices and never finish the sentence. And our clan, the Stoneback, caught directly between both of them with less power than either and no real allies anywhere near. Every few years the Emberclaw pushed south, took land, took food, and the Stoneback just quietly moved out of the way. Survival math. My mother had lived through 17 territory disputes. She wasn't a fighter. She was a survivor. There is an important difference. And on day 1, when she looked at me and turned her back, I understood exactly and completely what I was to her. Not a child, a cost. A tier 7 hatchling in a contested forest doesn't get the benefit of the doubt. It draws predators. It slows everyone down. It gets left. I had maybe 1 full season before she stopped feeding me entirely. Maybe 2 before she drove me out of her territory for good. I know how that sounds, but apex predator logic doesn't care how it sounds. Sentiment is a luxury. Survival is the only real currency. So on day 9 I made a decision. I was done waiting for a situation that was never going to improve on its own. I needed a different plan. Here's what nobody in the Ashvin understood about merc scale dragons. Yes, we're dead last. No weapons, no armor, no elemental breath. But there is a reason merc scales haven't gone extinct. Despite being bottom tier in a world full of things that would happily eat us, merc scales are the most adaptive bloodline in existence. Our bodies don't specialize in one thing. They absorb and shift over time. Every wound we take, we heal back slightly different than before. Every environment we survive in, our body adjusts to fit it better. Normally this process takes decades. Painfully slow, marginal gains over a lifetime. That's how it works under normal circumstances. But the key phrase there is normal circumstances. A human brain running inside a merc scale body is not a normal circumstance at all. My first real experiment happened on day 9 of my life. A female hatchling had been quietly digging up a bitter root near the entrance. The others all ignored it, too strong, too weird. But she kept eating it anyway, and I noticed she healed faster than everyone else. I waited until she left the spot. Then I crawled over and ate absolutely everything she had left behind without hesitating for a second. It tasted exactly like licking a battery that had been rolled in old Jim's sock. I swallowed every single bite and did not complain once. That night, the bite wound on my tail, barely closing after a full week, sealed completely shut. Clean, no inflammation, just gone. I didn't tell anyone. I went back the next morning, dug up more root, and started mapping the entire floor of the area around the cave. Every plant, every root, what the hatchlings avoided, what the adults ate, what prey animals wandered toward. All of it, cataloged. Information. That was my first real weapon. The only one available to a tier 7 runt who hadn't grown into anything useful yet. By week 4 I had eaten 17 different plants the other hatchlings had completely ignored. 3 of them made me sick for a full day. 1 of them made me genuinely sick for 3 days, and I thought at one point that I was actually dying. I was not, fortunately, dying. The other 13 did something. Small things at first, hard to measure, but real and getting slightly more noticeable every single week. My scales grew denser than they should be at my age. My eyesight sharpened enough that I could track insects at 50 meters in low light. My legs got faster, noticeably. Meaningfully faster than any hatchling my size had any business being at this stage of development. The others hadn't noticed any of it yet. I made absolutely certain of that by practicing something I call deliberate incompetence. Looking weak is a skill. I trained it the same way I used to approach debugging, methodically, obsessively, until it was completely natural. Slightly hunched posture near the big ones. Slow uncertain movements. A flinch whenever one of them looked directly in my direction. Let them see exactly what they expected. The runt. The liability. The merc scale that wouldn't last a full winter. That was the disguise. Because the moment any of them realized I wasn't exactly that anymore, they would stop underestimating me. And that was my only armor. The first real test came at the end of week 6, when Mother dropped a fresh kill, a large forest deer, and stepped back to watch. Normal feeding order. Biggest first, smallest last. By the time the Crimson won and his favorites finished, almost nothing remained for me. This had been the pattern since week 2. A calorie deficit that should have killed a normal merc scale hatchling several weeks before now. But this time I had prepared for it. While the others were busy feeding, I slipped away to the very back of the cave. Nobody noticed. Behind a rock shelf I had spent for full days carefully moving, 1 inch at a time, only when everyone else was asleep, was my cache. 6 small animals. 3 caught in vine traps I built from materials near the cave. 2 I chased down during my 1 solo hour each day. 1, I'll be honest, I'm not particularly proud of this one. Stolen directly from a hawk's nest 40 meters up a sheer cliff face. I was a 28-year-old human trapped in a hatchling's body. I had built, at 6 weeks old, what was functionally a food storage operation. No dragon hatchling in the history of the Ashfin had ever done anything like that, because none of them ever needed to think that far ahead. They had strength, they had rank, they had their mothers feeding them. I had exactly none of those things, so I built something else instead. I ate alone in the dark in total silence. Every bite felt like a small clean victory. Every calorie felt like one more day past extinction. The merc scale wasn't supposed to survive this long. Fine. I intended to go considerably further than anyone in this forest expected of me. Around week 7 I started seriously studying the forest itself, not just as a place to hide in, but as a system with its own logic. The Ashfin had patterns everywhere once you knew how to look. Prey clustered near the eastern ridge at dusk. The North Stream ran clean at dawn. Wind shifts exactly 3 days before a heavy storm. The adult dragons read all of this by pure instinct after years of living inside it. I read it differently. Mapped it the way I used to map software architecture. Built a mental database no other creature here had bothered to build. By week 8 I knew the Ashfin better than my own mother did. Not in terms of power or territory. In terms of raw, usable information. I knew which 3 valleys flooded first in heavy rain and which one the Ember Claw Scouts use as a regular passage when patrolling south. I knew the exact deer trail that ran at dawn and exactly where the blind spot was, the one gap, where a hunter could wait without being scented. I knew about the cave system under the eastern ridge, the one that smelled like old sulfur, the one every adult dragon had written off as empty. It wasn't empty. I knew that already. I wasn't ready to deal with what was actually in there yet, but I filed it away carefully for later. Mother came to check on me once during week 8, just the one time. She looked me over the way you assess something you've half given up on. She weighed the math of keeping me alive versus not, decided it still barely worked. Then her eyes moved down to my legs and stopped there. I caught it immediately. A flicker behind her eyes. Confusion. The beginnings of suspicion. My legs were to develop for my age and bloodline. I slumped my posture before she could process what she was seeing. Shuffled my feet slightly inward. Let my tail drag along the cave floor. The suspicion cleared from her face. She turned away and walked back out. I let out a slow, careful breath. That had been genuinely close. Week 9 was when the whole situation shifted into something I hadn't planned for and couldn't fully prepare myself to handle. I was out before dawn. My usual solo are in the forest, moving along the northern edge of the territory when I first heard it clearly. Not close, maybe 3 kilometers out, but in the total pre-dawn silence of the Ashfin it carried across the distance like a struck bell. A sound I had never heard before and never cataloged. A deep resonance that didn't match anything in my mental database of local creatures. Not Emberclaw. I had memorized their call patterns weeks ago. Not wolves, bears, or the massive elk that sometimes drifted into the area. Something else. Something I had no category for yet. The birds went completely silent for a full minute after the sound faded away into nothing. The deer I had been quietly tracking froze in place, every muscle locked, and then bolted south as hard as it could without looking back. I sat still in the undergrowth and let my human brain run at full speed. There were Tier 1 creatures in this world I had not mapped yet. The Void-Fanged dragons held territory to the east, and they had never come this far west. There had never been a reason for them to come this far. I turned and moved back toward the cave. Not panicking, but fast. Control fast, the kind that doesn't waste energy or leave obvious tracks. The hatchlings were still asleep when I got back. Mother was standing at the entrance, rock armor still, eyes locked on the north awake. She had heard it too. And her expression, after 9 weeks of watching her face every single day, was something I had never seen before. Not caution, not the cold calculation she used when assessing threats she already understood and had a prepared response for. Something else, not fear. That was fear. On the face of a Tier 4 dragon who had survived 17 territorial wars over the course of her entire long life. That was the moment I understood with complete clarity that whatever I had been building, the cache, the maps, the quiet, slow evolution. I needed to accelerate everything. Whatever was coming toward the Ashfin from the north had just changed the entire timeline I was working with. I looked at my front claws in the gray pre-dawn light. Longer than last week, sharper. 9 weeks of eating what the others were too proud to touch. Not enough. Not even close to enough yet. But it was a foundation. And a foundation is still a start, no matter how small it looks right now. I went back into the cave. Back to my corner. Back to the dark and the planning and the long, patient work of becoming something this forest feared. The runt wasn't going to stay a runt. That had never actually been in question, not for me. I just needed a little more time to get there. And whatever was waking up somewhere out there to the north of us, whatever made a Tier 4 dragon go pale with fear at dawn, it was going to have to wait its turn. I wasn't ready yet, but I was going to be. That was the only thing I was ever certain of. Drop a comment. What do you think is coming from the north? If you want to find out, you already know what to do. 3 days passed after that sound in the north. 3 days of complete silence. No repeat, no follow-up, just the forest pretending nothing happened. Mother went back to her normal routine like it never occurred. Hunted. Return. Fed the strong ones first. Ignored me almost entirely. The other hatchlings forgot about it within a day. Their attention spans were exactly what you'd expect from creatures that ran on pure instinct. But I didn't forget. I don't forget things. That's the one ability a human brain has that no amount of dragon bloodline can compete with. I spent those 3 days doing 2 things. Eating every strange plant I could safely test on myself, and watching the northern tree line constantly. On the 4th morning, I found something near the boundary of Mother's territory that stopped me completely cold the moment I saw it. A footprint. Single. Pressed so deep into the soft earth near the stream that whatever made it had to weigh something extraordinary. The shape was an Emberclaw. I had memorized their track pattern weeks ago. Wide, four-toed, heavy rear claw drag. This was completely different. 5 points of contact. Longer stride than anything I cataloged. And the depth? I put my entire body into that print and barely filled it. I stood there for a long moment doing math I did not enjoy doing. Then I memorized the exact shape and location and walked back to the cave. I said nothing to anyone. What was I going to do? Tell Mother? She already knew something was wrong. Telling her wouldn't change the timeline. What it would change is how she looked at me. Right now I was still the invisible Runt. The moment I started bringing her useful information, she would start paying real attention to what I was actually capable of. And I wasn't ready for that yet, not by a significant margin. So I kept it to myself and I accelerated the only plan I actually had. Push the Merc scale adaptation ability as hard and fast as possible. The problem with Merc scale adaptation is that it needs triggers. The body won't change without a reason. It needs pressure to respond to. Normal Merc scales get the pressure slowly. Weather, hunger, minor injuries over years. I needed to manufacture pressure on a faster schedule. I started with cold exposure. Every night after the others slept, I went to the northern stream where the water ran coldest and stayed in it. First night I lasted maybe for minutes before the shivering got bad enough that I had to stop. I went back the next night anyway, and the next. By the end of week 10 I could sit in the water for over an hour without any shivering at all. My body had simply adjusted and moved on. Small change, but it was a data point. The adaptation was real and it was responding to deliberate pressure, not just random environmental stress. I started testing other things. Height exposure, climbing the cliff faces around the territory until my legs burned completely through. Then higher, impact resistance. I won't describe this in detail because it was genuinely not my most dignified week, but the results were measurable. By week 11 my legs had developed muscle density I had no scientific framework to explain. Fast twitch response that felt almost mechanical. I could clear 8 meters in a single bound from a standing start. I tested it alone in the dark and stood there staring at the landing point. A normal Merc scale my age could clear maybe 3. A crimson-blooded hatchling, the strongest of our clutch, could clear about 5. I didn't celebrate. I cataloged it, went back to the cave, filed it under things nobody was ever going to find out about before I was ready. The Crimson One's name, as close as the dragon language translated, was something like Ashrok born in fire. I called him Ash in my head. Ash had established himself as the undisputed dominant hatchling in our clutch by week 2 and had been running that position ever since. He was genuinely impressive. I'll give him that. Smart for a pure instinct creature. Fast. Already developing real combat patterns in play. He had also bitten me 3 more times since week 3. Each time I did the same thing. Limped away. Found a corner. Kept building. Every bite healed differently than the last one. Slightly tougher skin at the contact points. Slightly denser scale coverage on my flanks. I started to understand that Ash was, without knowing it, doing me a significant favor. He was giving my body exactly the triggers it needed. I considered thanking him. Then I remembered the tail incident on day 3 and decided I would find a different way to express my gratitude later. On day 78, I kept an exact count. Something happened that I had not planned for and could not have predicted from any angle. Mother came back from a hunt with no kill. She had gone out in the early morning and returned before midday empty and visibly agitated. That had never happened before. In 78 days she had never returned without something. Even on bad days she brought back something small. The hatchlings picked up on her mood immediately. Even Ash went quiet. Everyone pressed back from the entrance and waited without making sound. Mother paced the length of the cave twice. Then she stood at the entrance and released a low sustained call that I had not heard her use before. I had been cataloging her vocal patterns for weeks. This one wasn't in any category one had built. It was something older, something urgent. About 2 hours later, 3 adult stonebags arrived at the cave. Not from our immediate group, further territory. Mother's extended contacts. They spoke for a long time at the entrance. Low vibrations, fast tongue clicks, the kind of compressed language adults use when hatchlings were near. But I understood every word, and what I heard made me push myself further back into the shadows of the cave and stay very, very still. The footprint I found wasn't Void Fang. The adults confirmed that much quickly. The Void Fang had their own problems on the eastern border. What had made the print was something that hadn't been seen in the Ashvan for over 2 centuries. Something the adults called a rootworm. I had no entry for rootworm in anything I had overheard before. That gap in my database was itself a significant piece of information. If something lived in this forest for centuries and the adults almost never mentioned it, either it didn't interact with them or they avoided it. Neither option was particularly comforting when that something had just left a footprint the size of my entire body near our water source. The 3 visiting adults left before sunset. Mother stood at the entrance alone for a long time after they had disappeared into the tree line. Then she turned and looked directly at the hatchlings. Her gaze moved across each one, assessing, calculating which ones were worth the investment. Her eyes reached me last, stayed for 2 full seconds, then moved back to Ash and the other strong ones and did not return to me again. I understood what that meant. I had always understood what that meant, but understanding something and feeling it are two completely separate experiences. I turned and went to the back of the cache area, ate 2 of the remaining stored animals, not because I was hungry, because I needed to think. A rootworm, to centuries absent from the Ashfin, now back, making sounds that frightened Tier 4 dragons and left prints I could sleep inside. And I was a Tier 7 hatchling with 11 weeks of forced adaptation and a food cache hidden behind a rock shelf. Great. Perfect. Ideal timing. Here is the thing about being the person who thinks in a room full of people who only feel. You see further, but you also worry further. Every other hatchling in that cave was going to sleep normally tonight. The information simply hadn't registered as personal threat to them. I was going to be awake for approximately the entire night running probability calculations. I had no interest in, but couldn't make myself stop. There was one thing working in my favor. One structural advantage that no amount of bloodline tier was going to make irrelevant. The cave system. The one under the eastern ridge. The one that smelled like sulfur and that every adult had written off as empty and never investigated. I had known for 3 weeks that it wasn't empty. I had detected intermittent low-frequency vibrations coming from the eastern entrance twice. Not threatening vibrations. Something else. Rhythmic. Almost mechanical. The kind of pattern that in my previous life I would have called a process. Something was running down there, consistently, quietly, without disturbing the surface world in any way that the adult dragons had noticed. I had been waiting until I was stronger to investigate it. The rootworm situation had just significantly moved at my personal investigation schedule. On day 80, I slipped out before dawn, moved east along the ridge base for about 4 kilometers, and found the secondary entrance to the system. The sulfur smell was strong enough to sting. I breathed through it and went in anyway. The tunnel was tight, but navigable at my current size. About 60 meters and the quality of the air changed. The sulfur thin. Something else replaced it, dense, mineral-rich, almost warm. The walls changed too. Stopped being raw rock. Started being something that looked almost processed, smooth. Faintly geometric, old but deliberate. I moved slower. Every sense I had was pushed to its limit. My merc scale adaptation had sharpened my low-light vision enough to manage in here. Then the tunnel opened into a chamber, and I stopped moving entirely and just stood there for a long moment taking in what I was looking at. The chamber was roughly circular, about 30 meters across. The ceiling was high enough that I could have fit 3 of my mother inside it. The walls were covered in something that pulsed with faint light, not fire. Not bioluminescence exactly, something that responded to my presence. In the center of the chamber was a structure I had no category for. Not natural, not built by anything I had learned about in this world. Roughly 2 meters tall, dense dark material I didn't recognize, covered in symbols that my pattern recognition kept trying to read as language. And from it, steady, rhythmic, completely consistent, came the low-frequency vibration I had been detecting from the surface for 3 weeks. I sat down in front of it. I looked at it for a very long time. I thought about everything I knew and most of what I didn't know. Then I said, out loud, in the empty chamber, to nobody, in Korean, of course, there's also a mysterious artifact. Why wouldn't there be? I reached out one claw and touched the surface of the structure. The vibration immediately increased. The wall lights pulsed once, sharply. Then everything went very quiet. The vibration stopped completely. The lights dimmed back to baseline. The structure just sat there looking at me. I pulled my claw back. The vibration restarted. I touched it again. It stopped again. I pulled back. It restarted. 3 times I confirmed this. The structure was responding to direct contact. Not aggressively, not randomly, consistently and specifically to my touch. That was interesting. On the 4th touch I held contact and did not pull back. The vibration stopped. The wall lights pulsed. Then something new happened. A warmth started at my claw tip and moved up my FORELEG. Slow, deliberate, like being filled with something that had been looking for a container. My merc scale adaptation process, the one I had been forcing with cold water and cliff faces and Ash's generous biting assistance, accelerated. I felt it clearly. The same internal shifting I had been monitoring for weeks, suddenly running at a completely different speed. Faster, deeper. I held on. The warmth reached my shoulder. Kept moving. I was watching my own foreleg in the dim chamber light, and I could see the scales changing. Denser. Darker at the edges. The texture shifting from the dull flat gray of standard merc scale into something with faint depth and structure to it. I stayed in contact with the structure for what felt like about 20 minutes. Then the warmth stopped on its own. The structure went still. I sat back and looked at my foreleg for a long time. Then I looked at the structure. Then I looked at my foreleg again. Then I said, in Korean, okay. So this is what was in the cave. I flexed the changed foreleg carefully. The density was real. The difference was not small or subtle. I turned and looked back down the tunnel toward the surface. Then I turned back to the structure and made myself a very clear personal commitment. I was going to come back here every single day. Whatever this thing was doing to my Merc scale adaptation process, I needed more of it. Much more. The rootworm was out there. The Ember Claw were always pushing south. My mother had the seconds to spare for me on my best day. Time was not on my side, but this chamber was. This structure was. And whatever ancient thing had built it and left it running alone in the dark for 200 years, it had just met the one creature in the ash film with both the instinct to find it and the brain to understand what finding it actually meant. I went back to the cave before dawn, slipped into my corner, looked at the changed forelook one more time and the faint morning light coming in. Ash was already awake across the cave. He looked at me the way he always did, with the flat casual contempt of someone who never felt threatened. I looked back at him with a flat expression of someone who was now visiting a mysterious underground structure every morning before he woke up. Neither of us said anything. The morning carried on as usual. From the outside, absolutely nothing had changed. That was exactly how I needed it. The Runt was still the Runt, invisible, irrelevant, safe from every eye that mattered, which was exactly the point of all of it. And every single morning before dawn, the Runt was going to be in that chamber, with one claw on that structure, becoming something else entirely. Drop a comment. What do you think the structure is? And if Ash knew what was happening under that ridge, do you think he'd leave it alone? I went back to the chamber on day 81, then day 82, then every single morning after that without missing once. Each session lasted until the warmth stopped on its own. The structure seemed to have a limit per visit. It would give what it gave and then go still. I didn't push past that limit. I had no idea what pushing past it would do, and I was not in a position to spend 3 days recovering from a mistake. By day 90, the changes to my body were significant enough that I had to actively work to hide them during daylight hours around the others. My scales had shifted from flat Merc scale gray to something with faint depth, still gray, but with a subtle layered quality the others didn't have. My foreleg musculature had restructured in a way I couldn't fully explain even to myself. Denser, more compact, like compressed rather than grown. My low light vision had sharpened to the point where the cave at midnight looked to me the way it looked to the others at noon, completely clear. And my hearing had extended into a range I hadn't had before. I could track individual heartbeats of the hatchlings from 30 meters away. None of this showed obviously on the surface. I still looked like a slightly undersized Merc scale to anyone who wasn't measuring me carefully. The disguise was holding, but I could feel the margin narrowing. At some point, the gap between what I looked like and what I was would become visible. I needed to be somewhere else before that happened. Somewhere that the reveal was on my terms and not on someone else's schedule. The rootworm had not been sighted directly by any stoneback in the weeks since the first sound, but the signs kept accumulating in the forest. 3 more deep prints along the northern stream, a section of old-growth trees near the ridge boundary that had been pushed over from below. Not knocked down, pushed up from underneath. Root systems torn out from below the soil line. The trunks toppled outward in a clean radius. Whatever had done that had moved through the underground the way we moved through open air. Like the earth itself was just a different kind of sky. I added the data point to my map and spent days thinking about what an ambush-proof territory actually looked like against something like that. The answer I kept arriving at was uncomfortable. Against a creature that moved underground at speed, surface territory didn't mean very much. The cave system under the eastern ridge was the single most defensible location in this entire area. Not because of the walls or the entrance, because whatever the structure in the central chamber was doing, it had been doing it for 2 centuries without drawing the rootworm's attention. Either the rootworm couldn't detect it or it actively avoided the area. Either way, the chamber was the safest ground in the Ashfin right now. I needed to move the operation there. The cache, the training, all of it. I needed the chamber as a base and I needed it before the situation escalated. On day 94 I started the process. Moving the food cache was easy. To nights of small transfers, nothing that would be noticed. Setting up a secondary training space inside the tunnel system took longer. The tight passages were actually useful for certain kinds of work. Lateral movement drills, rapid direction changes in confined spaces. The kind of agility that open field predators never bother to develop. I was building a fighting style that didn't exist in this forest vocabulary. Not strength first, not speed first, environment first. Use the terrain, control the space. Make every fight happen on ground you chose and they didn't. That was the theory. I was testing the practice. On day 96, while I was running tunnel drills before sunrise, Ash found my old cache location behind the rock shelf. He had clearly been watching me slip away at odd hours and had followed my trail back to the rock shelf. By the time I got there, he was already inside. He had eaten everything, every stored animal, every dried root, the entire 2-week buffer I had built over the previous month. All of it gone. He was sitting there with that flat, dominant expression when I came in, waiting to see what I would do, testing the dynamic one more time. The old response would have been to back down, limp away, file it, and move on. I stood in the entrance and ran the calculation very quickly. Day 96. Scales reinforced. Legs restructured. Hearing extended. 11 days of chamber sessions in addition to surface adaptation work. Versus Ash. Crimson Bloodline. Tier 2. Genuinely strong. Genuinely fast. Genuinely experienced at winning every physical confrontation he entered. I backed down. Turned around. Walked away with the same slow, uncertain shuffle I had been performing for 96 days. Same as always, from the outside. But for the first time, the calculation hadn't been automatic. For the first time, backing down had been a choice rather than the only available option. That distinction mattered more to me in that moment than I expected it to. I sat with it for a while in the dark of the tunnel and let it settle. Not yet, but getting closer. The window was narrowing, and not just because of my own development. The external situation was also moving fast. On day 99, Mother called all the hatchlings to the cave entrance for the first time since we were born. Full group, no exceptions. She stood in front of us and released a structured series of vibrations and clicks that took me a moment to parse, because it was formal language, the kind adults use when conveying something that needed to be remembered precisely. Not casual communication, something closer to an announcement. The Ember Claw had pushed their southern boundary by 3 kilometers in the past 2 weeks. 3 kilometers in 2 weeks was not a patrol adjustment. That was the opening move of a territorial claim. It meant scouts first, then a dominant male establishing presence, then a full push to follow. Mother was giving us information that she had never given hatchlings before. That fact alone told me how serious the situation had become. She looked at Ash when she finished, not at the others. At Ash, because Ash was the one she was betting on. He was the investment that mattered. Then her gaze moved briefly across the rest of us and landed for exactly 1 second on me, the same seconds as before, then moved on. I watched Ash process the information, watched his posture shift, chest slightly forward, jaw set, the body language of someone accepting a role. He was good at that part. The performance of strength came naturally to him. He had been doing it since day 3, and he had never once stopped. I went back to the chamber that night instead of waiting for morning. I pressed my claw to the structure and stayed until the warmth stopped. Then I pressed it again immediately. The structure pulsed once, different from the usual rhythm, brighter, almost like a question. I held contact. The warmth came back, slower this time, different texture, deeper than the surface level adaptation it had been driving in previous sessions. It reached somewhere internal that the other sessions hadn't touched. I don't have a precise biological term for what changed. I just felt it shift. My breath, the mossy, useless, wet farce breath that had been my single most embarrassing feature since the moment I hatched into this world. Something moved in the structure of it. Not fire, not lightning or ice. I was merc scale to the bone, and that wasn't going to change overnight. But the density shifted. The pressure behind it increased in a way I could feel building from somewhere in my chest that hadn't been active before. I didn't test it inside the chamber. I didn't know what the structure would do if I discharged something directly inside it, and I wasn't finding out. I went to the tunnel entrance, faced the open hillside in the pre-dawn dark. Nobody around. 2 kilometers from the cave. Completely alone. I exhaled, deliberately, pushed the new pressure forward the way you push air when you're trying to project your voice across a large room. The moss and farce smell came out first as usual. Then behind it, a low, dense wave of something else. Not visible, but the grass flattened. A 2-meter circle of hillside grass lay completely flat in the direction I had breathed. I stood there looking at it in the gray early light. It wasn't fire. It wasn't lightning. It was pressure. Concentrated, directional, and apparently strong enough to flatten a small patch of landscape. I filed it under weapons available and went back to the cave. Ash was still asleep. Everything looked exactly the same as when I had left. I lay down in my corner, looked at the cave ceiling, thought about a lot of things in sequence until the others started waking up around me. The pressure breath was a beginning. We compared to what Ash could do with a proper Crimson Fire Blast by now. Not even close to comparable. But it was mine. It had come from the structure, from 10 weeks of deliberate adaptation, from the accumulated result of choosing to think instead of react. Nobody in this forest knew I had it. Nobody knew about the chamber. Nobody knew what the rock shelf at the back of this cave used to contain. Information asymmetry. That was the only real advantage available to the bottom-tier creature in a world built entirely around raw power rankings. And I had been building that asymmetry for 99 days with absolute patience and 0 announcements. I intended to keep building it. Day 103 was when the rootworm made direct contact with the stoneback territory. For the first time since its return. Not an attack, not a confrontation. Something stranger and in some ways more unsettling than either of those things would have been. It left something at the edge of Mother's territory line. A deliberate placement, not a drop kill, not a territorial mark in any pattern I knew. A single smooth stone, dark material, covered in symbols that I recognized immediately the moment I saw them. From 20 meters away in the brush, the same symbols that covered the structure in the chamber. Identical, not similar, identical, down to the spacing and the depth of the markings. I stayed hidden in the brush for a very long time after Mother and other adults came to examine the stone and then walked away confused. The rootworm knew about the chamber. Had to. No other explanation for those symbols on that stone in that location at this specific moment. And it had just sent a message to the territorial owners of the ground above the chamber. A message that nobody here could actually read, except me. And I couldn't read it either, not the specific content. But I understood the fact of it. The rootworm was communicating, not threatening, not marking, communicating. That was a level of behavior that completely rewrote every assumption I had built about this creature. I went to the chamber, the night, pressed my claw to the structure. The vibration was different, agitated, faster than the baseline rhythm. The structure knew, whatever it was connected to, it had registered the stone being placed above. It was responding to that. The warmth that came through my claw was more intense than any previous session. It ran all the way through me before I had time to brace for it. When I came back to full awareness, I was sitting on the chamber floor and the wall lights were running at 3 times their normal brightness. I looked at my reflection and the smooth section of the wall opposite the structure. Looked for a long time. Then I said, quietly, in Korean, okay. The rootworm is trying to talk to whatever is in this chamber. And I am currently the only thing in this chamber. This is fine. It was not entirely fine. But panic was not a tool I had ever found useful, and I was not about to start finding it useful at this stage. I pressed my claw back to the structure. Steady. Deliberate. The same way I had approached every session since day 80. No drama. Just contact. The vibration settled. The lights dimmed back toward baseline. The warmth came through at normal intensity. Normal session. Normal progression. Whatever the structure was registering about the situation outside, my presence was apparently a stabilizing factor. That was useful to know. I stayed until the session ended naturally. Then I went back to the surface, back to the cave, back to the corner, back to looking like nothing. Morning came. Ash woke up. Mother left to hunt. The hatchlings ran their usual routines. The forest looked exactly like it always had. But somewhere under the eastern ridge, a structure that had been running alone in the dark for 2 centuries had just shifted into a new mode. And somewhere in the northern Ashfin, a creature that shouldn't be capable of complex communication had just sent a message to the structure. And in the corner of a cave, the smallest and least significant hatchling in the stoneback clutch was lying completely still, thinking very fast. The runt who was not a runt, the liability who was building something none of them could see yet, waiting for the right moment with full patience. That moment was getting closer. I could feel it the way you feel a shift in air pressure before a storm, not visible yet, but absolutely certain. Whatever was coming next was going to change the shape of this farce permanently. I intended to be ready for it. I intended to be the reason for it. Drop a comment. Do you think the rootworm is an enemy or something else entirely? Because I had a theory forming and it changed everything. My theory about the rootworm had been forming since the moment I saw those symbols on the stone. And the more I turned it over, the less I liked it. Not because the theory was wrong. Because if it was right, everything I thought I understood about the Ashfin needed to be completely rebuilt. The structure in the chamber wasn't abandoned. It wasn't ancient debris left behind by something that had moved on centuries ago. It was a relay, something built to maintain a signal, to hold a connection between 2 points across a very long distance and a very long period of time. The rootworm wasn't a predator that had wandered back into the Ashfin after 2 centuries away. It had been gone because it was somewhere else. And now it was back. And the first thing it did on returning wasn't hunt or claim territory. It sent a message to the relay in the chamber, which meant the rootworm and whoever built the structure were connected, had been connected for at least 200 years, probably longer. And I, a tier 7 Merc scale hatchling who had been using the relay as a personal gem for the past 23 days, was sitting in the middle of it. I spent 2 full days just thinking about that, running the implications forward in every direction I could see. Most of the directions were complicated. One direction was straightforward. The rootworm had sent a message. The relay had registered it. The relay knew I was there. 3 facts, 1 question. Had the relay reported back? Was the rootworm already aware that something was in the chamber using its structure? And if so, what did it think about that? I went to the chamber on day 105 and sat in front of the structure, without touching it. Just watched it for a long time. Listening. The vibration was back to its baseline rhythm, steady, consistent. No agitation like the night after the stone was placed. Calm. Normal. Running. I pressed my claw to it. The warmth came through immediately. No hesitation, no change in quality. Whatever the relay thought about the situation, it wasn't hostile. That told me something. Either the rootworm hadn't been informed about me yet, or it had been informed and had decided to wait and observe. Both options meant I still had time. I used every second of the session, stayed until the warmth stopped, went back every morning without fail. By day 110, the pressure breath had developed a range. I tested it at distance in the pre-dawn dark on the eastern hillside. 12 meters. A concentrated directional wave that flattened grass and stripped bark from the near side of a tree I aimed at deliberately. Not devastating. A crimson fire blast from ash at full charge would have turned the tree to ash from 30 meters. My 12 meters of bark damage was not comparable, but it was mine, completely unique. No other Merc scale in recorded dragon history had developed a pressure breath. I had checked via overheard conversations. Merc scales adapted, but they adapted to survive. Thicker scales, better cold tolerance, slightly enhanced senses over decades of slow pressure. They didn't develop offensive capabilities. The bloodline didn't go in that direction because it had never needed to. Adaptation was defensive by nature, except when you put a human brain in the body and started using a 2-century-old relay structure as a daily training apparatus. Then apparently it did. I extended the range test every third morning. By day 118, I was consistently hitting 18 meters with directional accuracy. The bark damage had deepened. The pressure wave was getting denser, harder at the leading edge, less like a strong exhale, and more like a physical impact. I was also faster than anything in the ashfin that I had directly observed. Not tier to fast. I wasn't going to pretend the gap was closed yet, but fast enough that when I ran a timed circuit of the tunnel system, I came out ahead of my own previous best by margins that didn't make sense on paper. The chamber sessions were compressing months of normal Merc scale adaptation into days. Something in that relay was accelerating the biological process. I still didn't know what the structure was built for originally. I had a growing list of things it clearly did and no clear picture of why it existed. That question was going to matter eventually. For now, I kept using it and kept the question filed under things to understand before they become urgent. Day 121. The day the Emberclaw Scout came into Stoneback territory for the first time without retreating at the boundary line. I was near the northern perimeter doing a mapping update when I caught the scent wrong bloodline. Too much crimson fire marker coming from the north. I went still in the undergrowth and watched the scout move through the tree line. Adult male, lean, fast, carrying himself like someone on assignment. He wasn't hunting. He was measuring, moving along the tree line at intervals, pausing at specific points, reading the scent markers on boundary trees, reporting home, telling the Emberclaw exactly where the Stoneback boundary was soft, where the patrol frequency was low, where the gaps were largest. I tracked him for 40 minutes without ever being detected. He completed his circuit and turned back north without triggering any adult Stoneback response, which meant Mother hadn't detected him, which meant the Emberclaw were already operating inside Stoneback territory with more stealth than we were tracking. I went back to the cave and sat in my corner and looked at the entrance for a long time. Mother came back from a hunt 2 hours later. She dropped the kill. The feeding order ran as always. I waited at the back, got nothing as usual. Ate from the tunnel cache afterward, I thought. The Emberclaw push was accelerating. The rootworm was back and sending messages. The relay was running in a new mode. The timeline had just compressed again. I needed to act before the situation forced a specific shape onto my options. Reactive survival was not the plan. I needed to be ahead of the curve. On day 123, I made a decision that every sensible calculation told me was at least 2 months premature. I didn't care. I went to find the rootworm, not to challenge it, not to run from it, to find it deliberately and on my own terms before anything else forced my hand. Not to fight it. I had exactly zero interest in fighting something that pushed old growth trees up through the earth from underneath its speed. I went to find it because it had sent a message to the relay, and the relay was mine now in every practical sense, and that made us connected whether either of us liked it or not. I followed the underground vibration patterns I had been mapping from the surface for weeks. The rootworm moved in consistent routes, predictable ones. 2 kilometers northwest of the chamber entrance was a point where the underground route came closest to the surface, a shallow section of tunnel. I sat above it in the pre-dawn dark, pressed one claw into the earth and pushed a low, deliberate pulse downward. Not aggressive, just present. I'm here. Nothing for a long time. Wind in the tree line, birds starting their first calls, the forest waking up around me while I sat completely still. Then the ground moved, a single slow pulse rising up through the earth under my claw. Not seismic, deliberate, exactly the rhythm I had sent down. It had heard me. It had answered, in the same frequency and the same deliberate pattern that I had used. Not coincidence, not random, a response. I sent another pulse. 3 beats this time with a pause in the middle. The ground answered with 3 beats and a pause in the middle. Exact mirror. We stayed like that for almost an hour. Call and answer. Call and answer. Building a vocabulary out of nothing in the dark before dawn on a hillside. It sounds strange. It was strange. I was a dragon hatchling having a percussion conversation with a creature the size of a small building underground. But I had been a software engineer. Pattern recognition was not a new skill for me, and what I was recognizing in those rhythms was something real. The rootworm wasn't dangerous, or rather, it was dangerous the way a mountain is dangerous. Enormous, capable of tremendous incidental destruction. But it wasn't hunting, it wasn't aggressive, it was something else. Something patient and old and apparently very interested in whoever had been using its relay. I went back every morning for 4 days. The vocabulary grew. Simple concepts first. Presence, direction, size as a relative term, time as a rough measure. On the 5th morning I pushed a new kind of pulse. Not rhythm, pressure. The same leading edge density I had been developing in my breath work. A small concentrated pulse pushed down through my claw into the earth. Directional, controlled. The clearest signal I had managed to send yet. The ground answered with something completely different from anything before. A full vibration that ran up through my entire body from ground contact. Not just my claw, my legs, my chest, my jaw. Every bone I had resonated for exactly 3 seconds, and then it stopped and the forest went quiet. I sat completely still for a moment. Then I looked down at my claw on the ground. Then I looked at the space in front of me. Then I said out loud, was that a greeting or a warning? I said it in Korean and obviously received no verbal answer, but the ground pulsed once more underneath me. Once steady. I chose to interpret that single pulse as a greeting. It was probably the most optimistic read available. I committed to it anyway and moved forward. On day 130, the Ember Claw made their second scout run, this time to adults, moving deeper into Stoneback territory than before. Mother detected them this time, released a boundary challenge call from the high ridge. The scouts paused, assessed, and then kept moving anyway. They kept moving. That was the part that mattered. A boundary challenge from a tier for Stoneback, and the Ember Claw scouts didn't even break stride. That meant the push was past the testing phase. The Ember Claw had done the math and decided the Stoneback couldn't stop them. They were probably right. Mother called the extended contacts again that night. 3 adults came. The conversation at the cave entrance was longer than the first one and quieter. I listened from the inner shadows and understood every compressed syllable of it. The Stoneback didn't have the numbers or the tier strength to hold. The realistic options being discussed were to submit to Emberclaw Territorial Authority and see the northern sections, or relocate entirely southward. Nobody in the conversation mentioned a third option, because there wasn't one. Not for a Stoneback group facing a tiered Emberclaw expansion push, unless something in the situation changed that the Emberclaw hadn't accounted for. Unless some variable entered the calculation that nobody expected. I went to the chamber, that night, pressed my claw to the relay. The session was the strongest one yet, warmth running deep, internal shifts I felt clearly. When I came back out of the tunnel before dawn, I went directly to the hillside, above the rootworm's root, and pressed my claw into the ground. I sent a new sequence, not call and answer, something longer, a pattern that took me 3 days of pre-dawn sessions to build into something coherent. The closest translation of what I was trying to communicate was, there is a threat moving from the north. It will reach a relay. I need more time. The ground was quiet for a long time after I finished the sequence. Long enough that I started composing what I would do if there was no answer. Then it answered, full body vibration again, 3 seconds, and then a different kind of pulse. Not rhythm, pressure. Moving upward through the earth. The ground in front of me rose slightly, a low rounded shape pushing up from below, not breaking through. Just lifting the surface 2 or 3 centimeters. It held for a moment and then settled back down. The earth went still. I looked at the spot for a long time in the pre-dawn gray. Then I understood. It was showing me where its tunnel ran directly under my position. Showing me the path. Telling me the relay was accessible from its side as well. It wasn't threatening the relay. It was offering a connection to it. Offering to add its access to mine. A combined claim on the chamber's function. I sat with that for a long time. An alliance with a creature nobody in this forest understood. Built on percussion conversations before dawn over 6 days. Completely insane. Strategically necessary. Totally on brand for the situation I had apparently decided to put myself in when I touched that structure. I pressed my claw back into the earth and set one single pulse. Steady. Clear. The Merc scale equivalent of a handshake. Yes. Agreed. Let's proceed. The ground answered immediately. One pulse back. Then the vibration of the rootworm's movement began. Slow and deliberate, heading toward the chamber. I ran back to the tunnel entrance, into the chamber, pressed my claw to the relay. The structure immediately shifted, both rhythms running together now, mine and the rootworm's. to different frequencies harmonizing in the same structure simultaneously. The wall lights ran at maximum brightness. The warmth through my claw was different. Not just adaptation acceleration, something structural, something that felt like a framework being built. I held contact until the session ended, came out of the tunnel as the sun was fully rising, stood on the hillside and looked out at the Ashfin. The same forest, the same territory lines, the same ember claw pressure coming from the north and the same stoneback land with no realistic answer to it. Except now there was something under the eastern ridge that hadn't existed yesterday. A shared claim on a 2-century-old relay running at full power. And a Tier 7 Merc scale hatchling with a pressure breath at 18 meters, restructured legs, extended senses, and the beginnings of a plan. Nobody had seen it coming. Nobody was going to see it coming. The runt, the liability, the one with 2 seconds of his mother's attention on a good day. I went back to the cave, laid down in my corner. Ash was doing his morning dominance displays near the entrance. The others watched and made impressed sounds. I watched too, studied his movement patterns the way I had been studying them for 130 days. Filed 3 new observations, updated the model. The Ember Claw were coming. The Rootworm was watching. The relay was running at power levels it hadn't seen into centuries. The forest was about to change, and somewhere in the back of the stone bat cave, the smallest hatchling in the clutch was lying completely still with his eyes half closed. Not sleeping, not planning, running every variable forward in sequence. Building the next move with the same quiet patience he had used for all 130 days. The story of how a Tier 7 runt became something this forest had never seen before was just getting started, and the next move was already decided. Drop a comment. Are you Team Kale or Team Ash? And what do you think happens when the Ember Claw finally crosses the boundary line for real?